It's the early 2000s, and I'm sitting in my friend Mary Lou's office. Mary Lou is a hypnotherapist, and she's going to hypnotize me to help me find the French in my head. Don't look at me like that. I know it's in there somewhere. I suffer from bilingual subtraction. I know, but it's a thing. Meaning French is my first language, but I only spoke it till I was about 3, though I know I understood it longer. You know, someone speaks to you in French and you answer in English. Linguists think that a heritage language, one that's spoken in the home, can't be totally lost. There's still a language map in your mind. So I'm being hypnotized to help me find the French in my head. I'm hoping for this Helen Keller sort of moment where water splashes on my hand and I understand intuitively that the word for water in French is l'eau. And the whole language tumbles out of some dark recess in my mind and flows effortlessly out of my mouth. I'd like to tell you I had that Helen Keller moment, but I didn't. It turns out how you lose a heritage language is complicated and emotional. So I may have a language map in my mind, but it's booby-trapped. I am Franco-American. I know, your first thought was canned spaghetti, right? Franco-American simply means my ancestors left France in the early 1600s, came to what is now Quebec, and eventually made their way to the United States. I can't tell you what generation I am because the border was always a fluid thing, with families going back and forth, looking for work, visiting relatives. I was born 15 miles from that border in Jackman, Maine. I remember, it's my first memory really, a visit from a parish priest. I'm maybe 3 years old, and my parents are trying to teach me how to say good afternoon, Father, in English, and I can't pronounce the TH. I keep saying, good afternoon, Father, because there is no TH sound in French. I went many years not thinking about my lost language. I mean, assimilation has been very good to me. I always self-identified as Franco-American. I was proud of my heritage, but I didn't know much about it beyond some colorful swear words and the fact that we ate pork pie or tourtière for breakfast Christmas morning. Yet, when I heard French spoken, even though I couldn't understand what was being said, the meter of the speech, the inflection, the energy of it felt like home. When I was a kid, I remember visiting relatives in Canada. This is after I lost my French. And listening to the energetic exchanges in this language that tugged at my heart. My sister Jane and I would play this game where we'd listen and laugh when the adults laughed, so it seemed like we understood. And then my relatives would ask if we spoke French, and my parents would say no, and my relations would say, quel dommage. What a shame. As I approached my 40s, I began to realize that something was missing from my otherwise happy life. Like many hyphenated Americans, I felt fragmented, neither here nor there. I longed to come home to my culture, but how could I be a good Franco-American if I didn't speak French? So I went searching for my lost language and found a whole lot more along the way. I'm a writer and performer, and what I found out eventually became a play called Pardon My French, which at its core is a search for home and belonging. I spent 2 years examining why the absence of the French language was as defining for me as its presence. My husband and collaborator, Gordon Carlisle, did research on Franco-American history and immigration, and we interviewed people in my family about growing up French in Maine. and I discovered wonderful stories of strength, resilience, and humor. Like the one about my Aunt Selena, who told my parents she wanted to be buried in the dress she wore to her 50th anniversary party. My Henry loved me in that dress. That's what I want to be buried in. So I look pretty for my Henry when I see him in heaven. I've gained a little weight since then, so just slice it up the back. Franco-Americans are the third largest ethnic group in New England. In northern New England, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont were the largest ethnic group. In Maine, a quarter of the population can trace their heritage back to French-speaking Canada. So why have you never heard of us? That's because we're silent and invisible. And there's some pretty good reasons for that. In 1919, an English-only law was passed by the Maine state legislature forbidding French to be spoken in public schools outside of language class. I've heard stories of children being made to write on the blackboard, "I will not speak French, I will not speak French, I will not speak French." Yet many children, my father included, spoke no English when they started school. When my dad was sent to the parochial boarding school in Jackman, he was not allowed to speak the only language he knew. In fact, children were punished if they were caught speaking French, and other children were rewarded with things like movie tickets for informing on them. My Aunt Celeste says she remembers being punished because her cousin was heard speaking French. Many of the nuns enforcing these laws were native French speakers. That English-only law wasn't repealed until the 1960s. Like many immigrants, we were different and therefore threatening. The author, David Vermette, discusses many of these issues in his book, A Distinct Alien Race, the title of which is taken from a newspaper article from 1889. The 1920s brought with it the rise of the KKK in the state of Maine. Their focus was primarily an anti-Catholic agenda. You might not be able to tell a Catholic by the color of their skin, but you can by their language. So speaking French made us a target. Yet, French survived. My parents were bilingual, as were my grandparents who lived nearby. In fact, my maternal grandfather, Adelaide de Bleuet, known as Blue, was born in Canada and didn't become a naturalized U.S. citizen till he was 42 years old. He spoke English, but his primary language was French. My parents had the best of intentions. They were going to raise their children bilingually. They've never been able to tell me why exactly we stopped speaking French at home. On the few occasions I asked, they said, "We don't want you to speak bad French and bad English like your cousins." I didn't know who these cousins were. And this didn't make sense because my parents were raised bilingually. In their homes, when asked a question, they answered in the language they were spoken to. They moved effortlessly from French to English, English to French. My sister Jane was born when I was 2. Around that time, my grandfather Blue became ill. He died when I was about 3. I think that between having an infant and a toddler, grieving the loss of my grandfather, and trying to run a small business, French just got lost in the shuffle. As the years passed, I understood less and less, then it was gone. French moved from the language of my birth to the language of secrecy, something my parents spoke when they didn't want Jane and me to know what they were talking about. Being hypnotized to find the French in my head wasn't my first attempt to recover my lost language. There was a period in the 1990s into the early 2000s where I was determined to relearn French. I needed to fill the void left by my lost language. And I know void might seem like too big a word, Speaking a language for 3 years doesn't seem like that big a deal. I mean, my French probably consisted of simple sentences and incorrect tenses and the word why over and over and over again. But picture your child, or a child you know. Picture being this child. The murmured endearments, your first word, your first step, raucous family gatherings, all in a language you no longer have access to. My memories need subtitles, and I long to make those memories whole again. I started by taking a conversational French class at our local university, but every time I walked into the classroom, my perfectionism got in the way. Waves of anger and frustration washed over me. My throat tightened up, and I felt like crying. So I decided on a different approach. I applied for and received a traditional arts apprenticeship grant to study French folk music. I was hoping to Frère Jacques on my way to fluent French. Didn't happen. Though now I can play the spoons. Oh, yeah. So I went back to conversational French class. Some time has passed, I told myself. It's all a matter of attitude. This should be no problem. But it was. So I hired a French tutor, which seemed like a good idea at the time. But you know what? When you're one-on-one, you can't just get by. You have to actually answer every question. The magnitude of this didn't hit me till I was alone in a room with a stranger talking to me in a foreign language. When you add in all the money I've spent on French language courses on tapes, CDs, now apps, I have spent a lot of money to parler français comme une bébé. I still remember the cover of one of these courses from the late 90s. On it is a photo of a mother and her young son sitting in front of the computer screen, and they look so happy to be learning French. But here's the kicker. Sitting on the kid's lap is a cat who is also looking at the computer. So it looks like even the cat is learning French. His little paws are on the keyboard. All of these language learning systems have the same promise. We will make it possible for you to learn a new language the way you learned your first. And that's the problem. Make it possible to learn a new language. French isn't a new language for me the way you learned your first, but French is my first language. The whole thing is just so confusing. And frankly, those happy people with their French-speaking cats still irritate the heck out of me. For me, French is fragile and precious, an egg in my hand. We'll go to a restaurant in Quebec City, Le Pain Sauté. I practice what I'm going to say. I walk in feeling confident. Salut, je m'appelle Suzanne Poulin, j'ai une réservation pour ce soir. Then they start speaking French to me at about 100 miles an hour. My brain totally short circuits, and all I hear is blah, 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 Suzanne, blah, 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 what? And I let my desire and perfectionism crush that egg. It's messy. And I come from a long line of tidy Franco-American women. Women who will clear your plate from the dinner table before you finish eating if you pause too long. They're that anxious to start doing the dishes. Women who spring clean their house from top to bottom every year. My mother had a special brush for straightening the fringe on area rugs. One Franco-American woman confessed to me that when her mother died, She and her sisters were discussing what to put in the coffin with her. Along with her rosary beads, they seriously considered burying their mother with her dustbuster. We don't do messy. One day, in the midst of researching and writing Pardon My French, Gordon said to me, "You know, Susan, you may never relearn French." He said this in a kind, loving way, and I knew in my heart it was true. So I got really mad at him. Like you do when someone you love says something you really don't want to hear. Once I calmed down, though, a miraculous thing happened. I surrendered to never speaking French. And that was the turning point for me. Within a week, I found a conversational French class through adult ed in my town. I decided to sign up because what did I have to lose? I realized in the past, when I took a French class, because it's my first language, I went into it thinking that I was going to be speaking French fluently at the end of 6 weeks. Now I'm approaching it as a hobby, a piece of knitting I can pick up and put down. For me, surrendering my expectations and approaching French as a second language was my way around the booby traps in my head. But it's not the only way. There's amazing work being done in heritage language reacquisition with Native American populations, Hispanics, Franco-Americans. Techniques incorporate language portals, sense memory exercises, visualization. In classes or conversation groups, people talk about family photos, sing songs, watch films, all with mixed levels of language learners in the same room. I hear people say all the time that the Franco-American culture is dying. I don't believe that's true. It's just changing. The Franco-American playwright Grégoire Chabot, or Greg Shabbat, as we call him, says, preservation is for meat, not culture. It's been over 15 years since we premiered Pardon My French. During that time, we've performed the show from central Pennsylvania to northern Maine. And you know what? My story is not unique. We're all looking for home and belonging. I know this to be true because after every performance, people come up to me and say, "This is my story." An African woman in Pennsylvania, a Hispanic woman in Baltimore, a Jewish guy from New York, "This is my story." An elderly Franco-American woman in Presque Isle, Maine, tears in her eyes, "This is the story of my children." I still study French off and on. I don't know if I'll ever learn to speak it again. I mean, the way I really want to, beyond the "Où est la bibliothèque" phase. But it's still on my bucket list. Right below, do a TED Talk. I'm hopeful. The biggest change for me in the last few years is I no longer feel like my French is lost. I realize it's still inside me. If I'm in a room of English speakers and French speakers, my head is with the English speakers, but my heart is with the French speakers. By examining and owning my story, being able to take my story and place it into that of my family's story, and our story into the larger cultural context of Franco-Americans and immigrants as a whole, I became more fully integrated. And now, I love that hyphen. I see it as a bridge between my heart and my head, between Franco and American. That bridge is where I hang out most of the time, where I can see the whole picture. My Franco-American me. And the view up here, c'est magnifique. Merci.